Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentaries have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in the world, according to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Always glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you, Irina. Again, several big topics today. Lots of time to start with politics, but this time let's start with Brown University and Bondi Beach massacre. What's happening means I thought the world should be moving towards a bit more peaceful, towards, as 2026 approaches, and this time we hear about, two different places. Incidents almost look like, some motivated. Help us understand someone who has not been following news so closely but suddenly learns about these things. What should they know? How should they understand these?
Essentially, the context is that there's been a spike in anti-Semitic incidents, including incidents of violence and terror, in recent months. This has been on the rise for a while. That is nothing new. But 2 years of globalizing intifada riots and violence and propaganda connecting Jewish communities around the world with the events in Gaza have obviously taken their toll, along with non-stop stream of conspiracy theories on social media and among some of the world's top podcasters. Some of the various extremists, Islamists, far right, far left, have essentially joined forces, and the overall impact of that has been radicalization, especially among young people. But besides that, there are also more ordinary vectors, such as people traveling abroad and getting radicalized on foreign soil, or self-radicalization online, or by following hate preachers of various types, or in social circles, communities, mosques, or other social areas. All of that has contributed to a rising hate climate, not just in terms of outright violence, but broader polarization, broader conspiratorial and hate mindsets, and all of that created a perfect storm. We are seeing a pattern where major holidays are now being used to target Jewish communities. October 7th terrorist attacks took place on Simchat Torah, a major religious holiday. There's been an attack in September around the high holidays, and now during the festival of Hanukkah, festival of lights, which historically reaffirms the idea of Jewish sovereignty, Jewish self-identity, and Jewish ability to publicly celebrate their cultural and religious uniqueness. There has been attacks that took place um, twice in a row in the span of 2 days. There was an attack at Brown University, which is an Ivy League school in Rhode Island, and there two students were murdered. One of them was the vice president of the Republicans. Another one was actually a foreign student from Central Asia, and 8 people were wounded, and some of them were hospitalized. Uh, the class that was attacked was also related to the topic of Israel, from what I understand. And initially, the suspect that was captured on camera was a Palestinian student who also has radical views, and he's been apparently a research assistant for a Palestinian professor at a university in the West Bank, which is actually affiliated with Hamas. And this guy was somehow involved in LGBTQ associations, but also in um, kind of a radical pro-Palestinian leftist organization, which seems a very strange and contradictory thing to embrace, given that Hamas, especially, has not been particularly kind to LGBTQ individuals, as in terms of torturing them, throwing them off the rooftops, and generally not welcoming them in any way, shape, or form. Nevertheless, that particular student was released, although the university consequently scrubbed his profiles on social media associating himself with the university, and as well as um, they did away with his official website linking him to the school. They did release an image showing another student in the vicinity of the events who is now a suspect, but that other person's identity appears to be obscured by a face mask, kind of like a COVID type mask. And the image was not particularly clear, if you ask me. Maybe very high level professional um, law enforcement uh, people can make something out of it, but I think for a lay audience looking at this image, it's hard to see what exactly it's showing. But it's been 100 hours since the incident took place, and apparently nobody's been found, and there appear to be no new leads. Um, The head of the FBI, Kash Patel, has been criticized over his handling of this incident. For instance, the fact that he prematurely announced a suspect who was released without any charges, and he was at a Christmas party while the investigation was at the White House Christmas party while the investigation was ongoing. Um, Regardless, there seems to be no new information about that investigation, and the next morning after this horrific incident, there was an attack on a Hanukkah celebration in Bondi Beach in Australia, where, as a result, 16 Jewish individuals of varying ages and backgrounds were massacred, and 42 others were wounded. One of the people who was there is someone I've known for many years. He's originally from Ukraine, grew up in Australia, made Aliyah to Israel, where he practiced as an international human rights lawyer. And only 2 weeks prior to the attack, he moved back to Australia to take a position with the local Jewish association, precisely because of the rising anti-Semitism in Australia. And to put these events in context, anti-Semitic incidents, especially violent incidents, have been on the rise in Australia at a disproportionate rate. The country is only 19 million people, and the Jewish community is obviously significantly smaller there than either in Israel or in the United States. But there's been over 1,000 violent attacks and arsons in recent years, even in this past year. And the Jewish community leaders have warned the Australian government about it. Nevertheless, Prime Minister Albanese has been focused more on criticizing Israel's actions in Gaza. He was one of the people who attended pro-Palestinian rallies and seemed to be supportive of some of the rhetoric that took place at these events. And many are furious with him for the handling of the situation, because his initial statement did not mention that the attack was specifically against Jewish targets, and moreover, his initial reaction was to restrict legal gun procurement rather than to discuss why an individual who was essentially on a watch list was able to procure 6 different types of shotguns and why these two Pakistani Australians were able to travel to a known terrorist hotspot in the Philippines without any questions asked upon their return. This is where they apparently were radicalized, or if they were radicalized earlier, this is where they were trained. The attack appeared to be planned. Um, and it was disrupted by another Muslim Australian individual who attacked the father and son duo. He grabbed the gun from one of them. He was shot in the process, apparently, by the police, which froze. The police also appeared to be completely unprepared. The incident took place over the course of 20 minutes before this passerby was able to intervene, and the police during this a good amount of time took no action, and one of the officers apparently even hid during the worst of the attack. Another hero, besides Ahmed Al Ahmed, who is recovering from a surgery in the hospital, is a 14-year-old girl who shielded two young children with her body despite already being wounded at the time. She is also recovering at the hospital, but there was a 10-year-old girl who was killed in the process. There was a Holocaust survivor who also died as a result of the attack. There was a rabbi who was killed, and there was a young Texas rabbi who was seriously wounded. He was trying to hide along with his baby, but he was wounded in the shooting. The attack sparked a serious backlash and criticism, including in the United States, from both Democrats and Republicans over the Australian government's essentially feckless handling of issues of extremism and radicalization inside the country, because the Pakistani Australians were not immigrants. They were born, or at least the son was born and raised in Australia, and obviously they were not despite all sorts of red flags, nothing was done to investigate and stop them before they did something horrible. And who knows what happens now. Um, the charges are indeed high. There are 59 charges, including 15 counts of murder, and there are also terrorist charges. So I am sure it's going to be a very high-profile trial. It is unclear how lenient the system is going to be. Consequently, in Europe, for instance, even murderers and terrorists are occasionally released on parole prematurely, rather than serving out life sentences or extensive sentences. We will see how that unfolds. Um, Europe was inspired by this situation to try to crack down on vocal anti-Semitism, such as the use of globalizing the Intifada rhetoric at rallies. Even the newly elected New York Mayor Mamdani, who himself has been criticized for that, did refer to the and condemn it specifically as an anti-Semitic attack. And even Turkey, the country, also mentioned that this was a specifically anti-Semitic attack. Nevertheless, many of the same people who are condemning this particular incidents are still claiming that globalizing the Intifada or general attacks on Israel are unrelated to this episode, and therefore are a completely separate topic of conversation. To these two incidents, I should add a few other violent incidents that took place in New York and in California, including an arson of a Jewish organization, which thankfully resulted in no injuries but did damage the building. There were physical attacks on visibly Jewish individuals in New York in several separate incidents. There was a professor in Australia, who was fired as a result of an anti-Semitic comments that were being made, and on and on and on. Finally, there was a very suspicious murder that took place very soon after these events in Brooklyn near Boston. in a wealthy neighborhood. A Portuguese national professor who led a major nuclear fusion, plasma fusion lab at MIT was found dead in his own house. He's 47 years old. He's been a professor at MIT for the past 10 years. He received his PhD in London, and he was an Israel supporter. Some reports describe him as being Jewish. Some of his friends claim that they were not aware of his any Jewish identity and that he celebrated Christmas. Whatever the case may be, he was very clearly and vocally an Israel supporter, and he was found dead after neighbors described hearing three shots and someone banging on his door. When they called the police, his body was found with no evidence of breaking or other criminal activity that would indicate a burglary that went deadly. So whatever the motive was, it may not have had anything to do um, with any sort of robbery motive, normal criminal motive. There are speculations that this could have been an act of vengeance by Iranians who recently announced that as a revenge for past activity, they would engage in targeted assassinations, especially against Israeli nuclear scientists. This individual had a European citizenship, but because of his vocal comments, perhaps a mistake was made and it was believed to be Israeli. He may have done some science research in conjunction with Israeli institutions in the past, and that also could have sufficed, or maybe they also believed that he was Jewish and therefore connected to Israel. Whatever the case may be, that is one of the theories, but so far no suspects or other information have been announced, and everyone who knew him was shocked by this development because of the nature of the violent death, because MIT described him as having simply passed without mentioning the fact that he was violently murdered, and also because of the extent of the impact of his research on environmental issues, on other, nuclear physics more broadly. He had one of the biggest labs at MIT, approximately 250 students, and many believe that it was no coincidence that he was targeted during this period of time, given that his pro-Israel views, that whether or not he was Jewish, the message was that he was being associated with Jewish causes.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So, what does President Trump? What are his views on all these happenings? Especially those in the U.S.
He did describe the attack in Australia as clearly anti-Semitic, um, but overall, his comments on this topic, on any of these incidents, were relatively subdued. There is no reason to believe that he is in any way supportive of what's going on, but he also has been far more vocal regarding the violent demise of the famous director Rob Reiner, who, along with his wife, who apparently was a photographer for the cover of Trump's book, The Art of the Deal. They were violently stabbed to death by their drug addicted, mentally unstable son, who has been charged with murder. In California, there was no love lost between Rob Reiner and Trump made that very clear in his comments, and he's been far more focused on this unfortunate domestic incident than on the series of horrific terrorist attacks and violent and anti-Semitic deaths that have been taking place across the country and international. Of course, he did condemn the Australian attack, but overall, he has been far less personally involved in these incidents than in some other um, uh, uh, domestic issues that have taken place in the past year. Um, so we'll see what happens in terms of actual investigations, but um, I do think the message from Trump has been damaging. I think it's positive that he condemned it, but I also don't think that he's seen as some sort of a personal champion on this issue either.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. I'm sure he's a very positive man and almost like a peacemaker, and he has been working for peace on many things. Especially, you see, let's first take on the Cambodia Thailand thing. The peace did not last for long. Then there's a new peace deal apparently, and Trump has touted it as peace building. What's happening there? Let's look at the smaller places, but are new places which can create more tensions in the world.
Well, Trump very quickly boasted about signing a new ceasefire between the two countries, but with any such high-profile peace deal, the first thing is to ask is whether this is actually a deal that resolves a core dispute or merely freezes escalation. Many deals, including this one, mere conflict management rather than conflict resolution. They reduce immediate violence, but they leave the contested issues intact. The Cambodia Thailand dynamics at the core about border disputes, domestic politics, and also management of nationalist narratives. The leaders temporarily accept deals under pressure from Trump to avoid economic shocks, to reassure investors and allies, and to reduce military risk. But the underlying strategic mistrust has not been resolved at all. Um, Simultaneously, the collapse of the Rwanda and Congo ceasefire also highlights how fragile some of these agreements are when armed groups retain incentives to rearm and when enforcement is weak. These ceasefires fail when they're being treated as merely regrouping periods and when external guarantors lack leverage or credibility. Trump has in no way been able to enforce the ceasefire in either scenario. With Cambodia and Thailand, he's threatened via economic leverage. With Rwanda, he put pressure on Rwanda and confronted the leadership there over the alleged backing of the M23 rebels, which the country continues to deny. None of that has resolved anything. The problem here is also that Trump's peace branding tends to emphasize deal making as a personal diplomatic method, which is effective at producing short term announcements when the parties want a symbolic umbrella to de escalate. But the much harder part here is implementation, verification, and the management of spoilers. So, the key difference between these two situations is the structure of armed actors. State to state agreements can be stabilized through institutions, through trade interdependence, and through military hotlines. But ceasefires involving non state or hybrid actors, such as the M23 rebels in Congo and also assorted violent groups in Rwanda, require stronger monitoring and disarmament sequencing. And also, the propaganda impact matters. A peace announcement is being used by Trump domestically to show strength, but it's mostly cosmetic. But a ceasefire collapse can be used to justify renewed crackdowns, cross-border pursuits, and to escalate narratives by the stakeholders. So regional organizations can play different roles. Asian style is often focused on quiet diplomacy and face-saving frameworks. African regional dynamics are more fragmented, often with overlapping interventions and competing patrons, which makes enforcement even harder. But the lesson from all of this here is that outcomes depend on structures, not slogans. If verification and incentives are insufficient or weak, deals become mere theater, and if economic and security incentives align, even imperfect deals can hold. So, what is likely to happen in the near term? The Cambodia Thailand deal, the new one, will likely continue reduce heat for some time, but it will remain vulnerable to domestic nationalist triggers. In the Rwanda DNC scenario, the situation is likely to remain unstable absent a stronger security architecture, meaning serious diplomatic effort for a longer term confrontation and de escalation. Both illustrated pieces is actually a process, not an announcement. The broader implication for everyone else is that Trump style diplomacy can win headlines, but conflict systems punish superficiality. Where the local incentive structure is not changed, the agreement is merely a pause, not an actual settlement. The gap between branding and durability is where future crises are likely to emerge. I don't think any of this is going away anytime soon, unfortunately, and we are likely to hear new deals with the same actors replaying under Trump. Um, so definitely there is a very big difference between deal announcement and deal durability, and unless M23 rebels are incentivized to disarm and to integrate into official structures, institutions, I think we'll be hearing about that story for some time.
Absolutely, Irina. Mr. Trump's, complaint has been that he does a lot for peacekeeping, but nobody gives him the credit that he deserves. And amidst all these peacekeeping efforts, we see South African elections and spiking tensions with the U.S. Denmark has put U.S. on the enemy list, and within the U.S. itself, MAGA and America First factions have split. Help us understand where, and even in Venezuela, I thought peacekeeping, talking a bit of peacekeeping will help, if perhaps even with a bit of pressure, but that even there, that escalation of tensions is there. Help us understand from all these different areas where we see a bit more, uh, difficulties for Trump's peacemaking efforts. What is happening in all these three places? How should someone in this part of the world understand this?
Well, first of all, Trump complaining that he's not getting enough credit is a very strange situation because he's gotten various awards from multiple countries, including Saudi Arabia. He recently got the FIFA Peace Prize established basically in his honor. He was specifically thanked by Maria Machado, the Venezuelan Nobel Prize winner, who dedicated her award to him. And of course, he's being constantly praised in the headlines, even by adversarial left-leaning media that had praised him for his efforts on the Gaza ceasefire. There were many people who lauded the conclusion of that ceasefire and the recovery of the hostages. And so I'm not really sure what additional credit, short of the Nobel Peace Prize itself, and that he needs, or why he believes that uh, credit cannot coexist with criticism for failed efforts, such as the alleged 24-hour end to the Russia-Ukraine war, which still hasn't happened, or the fact that many of his peacebuilding efforts end up not having any long-term impact, which is also the case. So I think his position as that is not particularly reasonable. Regarding everything else, the national security strategy released by the Trump Organization, while it's not a law, it's a policy that can be changed at any time and whose implementation raises a lot of questions. Signals a lot of things that are indeed quite concerning for both sides. When allies publicly downgrade trust, it reflects accumulated disputes over intelligence sharing, defense posture, and political rhetoric. It's not a result of a single event, and it's not the national security strategy alone that caused Denmark to take the drastic step of basically designating US as a hostile party. Trump's not only rhetoric but efforts to infiltrate and to gather intelligence inside Greenland, which is as an autonomous but belongs to the Danish ecosystem, have raised a lot of ire and caused a lot of bad blood between the two countries already, and it's been ongoing since the start of Trump's second term. And while Trump has focused on other issues more recently, the overall concern has not been fully resolved, especially since the Trump administration never issued a clear denunciation of the past policy on this matter. They just because they focused at least temporarily on other concerns does not mean that they have formally abandoned the posture that irked, and rightfully so, Denmark. Or they, moreover, U.S. has consistently continued to attack Europe rhetorically and through other means over asserted issues. The Russia-Ukraine war too appears to favor Putin quite and appears to disregard a lot of the internal security issues. In addition to essentially claiming that U.S. wants to reshape Europe in its own, in the Trump administration's image, and essentially validating the meddling into European elections and support for far-right populist parties, which in itself caused a lot of ire. U.S. appears interested in breaking the European Union apart by courting Poland, Hungary, Austria, and other countries away from that structure altogether, which the European Union does not consider in any way acceptable, anyway, in any, as if any of the U.S. states were to be courted by third parties in an attempt to separate, let's say, California and New York, and to leave other states intact to do their own thing. So all of this caused a great deal of damage. Denmark is particularly sensitive to sovereignty issues, Arctic security, and alliance credibility. It has done a lot in terms of intelligence sharing with the US. So symbolic labeling carries a lot of weight domestically. This is also in response to domestic concerns, but also the fact that Denmark has been under physical attack from assorted drones, underwater sea cable attacks by Russia and China, presumably, and US has not been particularly supportive. Internal US factional splits also matter because allies seek predictability. If policy direction appears to swing between engagement and transactionalism, that also contributes to the overall erosion of trust. And even serious diplomatic rifts can often coexist with continued military cooperation inside NATO structures, but nevertheless, when it has reached the point where one country is literally threatening publicly to meddle in the politics of another, that puts the entire NATO structure at risk. The practical impact would translate presumably into slower and more constrained intelligence cooperation, tighter data access rules, and more cautious coordination on sensitive technology, if not outright boycotts. Of course, adversaries also benefit when allied cohesion looks performative rather than durable because it invites probing and pushing the envelope, and that's exactly what Russia and China and even Iran have been doing more recently. More importantly, Denmark's broader European position is also shaping its signaling because it's also trying to enforce EU unity, and which US is basically challenging at this point. And while the US side may very well treat such moves as political theater, allies treat them as risk management rather than commentary. So even if Trump has no serious intention to follow through in anything more than slogans and speeches, for individual countries that is quite sufficient, and even that messaging may have an impact for them domestically and internally. Now, the likely outcome eventually is probably going to be some form of damage control and quiet recalibration rather than complete rupture, because shared security interests remain strong, and at the end of the day, Denmark believes that it is better to preserve some form of relationship than to part ways completely and leave each other even more open to be exploited by adversarial forces. And at the same time, the deeper trend is alliance stress from domestic politics, with the internal narratives becoming foreign policy driver. And that's not a good thing, because domestic politics should be focused on domestic issues and foreign policy should be left to the governments rather than to the street. But all of that is being entirely reshaped by the Trump administration and the MAGA movement's approach.
Absolutely. So, what about Venezuela? Where is it going? I thought either, solutions will come out very quickly. Either Maduro leaves, or there will be, some sort of a issue that will get sorted soon. How does it look like? And what is happening with South Africa? Why would there be tensions between South Africa and the US?
Now, with Venezuela, I don't think this story will be resolved anytime soon. Many believe that it's in fact nothing more than on the one hand, a distraction from the Epstein scandal and other internal issues, including the failing economy. On the other hand, others believe that some figures within the administration, then, such as Stephen Miller and Radcliffe, the head of the CIA, are pushing escalation beyond, some economic and deterrence signaling, because with U.S. foreign policy now being constrained and contained in the Western Hemisphere, there is not much move for foreign policy hawks or activists to move beyond what is allotted on the table. And this is just a way for some people to show strength, to accumulate personal power, and to have an opportunity to show some muscle. Regardless, for now, at least, the escalation is still mostly economic and political. And yes, well, it has symbolically seized a local tanker that was allegedly delivering uh, um sanctioned oil to its adversaries such as Iran and China, has so far had not done anything to prepare for any long-term military engagement, other than designating the entire government as a foreign terrorist organization, which does give it potential room to escalate militarily, at least in the form of strikes on specific targets internally. But this, at the same time, does not necessarily mean a war. So far, um, the exports in Venezuela have been affected significantly, but Venezuela started escorting its ships externally to prevent them from being attacked by the US. And the US has so far not sunken any ships, and has not taken any action other than that one tanker. Um, Maritime enforcement is being used as economic statecraft to disrupt revenue channels rather than merely relying on diplomatic statement. The tanker seizures is also a signal to insurers, shippers, and intermediaries that sanction risk is very real, which raises compliance pressure beyond that particular vessel. Now, the Venezuela, Iran, and China linkages are highlighting how sanctioned states are building shadow logistics ecosystems, often using flag changes, ship to ship transfers, and opaque ownership. So, exposing all of those things to the public is not necessarily a bad thing. Escalation with Maduro is also blending alleged and real human rights concerns, migration pressures, and geopolitical signaling here. But all of that, of course, is overshadowed by the scandal over the sunken and struck fishing boats and the law, international violations of the international maritime law, which mandated the U.S. to rescue the individuals who survivors rather than finishing them off. Um, so the messaging about human rights concerns seems to be in conflict with the failure to rescue human beings, even if they're suspected drug dealers or even terrorists. The enforcement is also a message to partners. If Washington is willing to act, allies may follow with port restrictions and financial scrutiny, but so far the response has been mixed. Some Caribbean states, such as Trinidad and Tobago and the Dominican Republic, have been supportive, but while others, like Colombia, which also is increasing tensions with the US and the United Kingdom, have steered clear and, in fact, even frozen intelligence sharing over the violations of international law. The risk, of course, is retaliation, whether it's asymmetric or in some other form, such as hostage diplomacy, cyber attacks, or manipulating migration flows. Of course, Maduro is in no shape to launch a serious conventional military attacks, but he and his cartel and terrorist counterparts can cause other types of damage. Meanwhile, the global oil markets can absorb some disruption, but repeated seizures and volatility can shift discounts, routing costs, and refinery decisions and cause some upheaval. So maybe for Trump, it's all about the oil markets. China's role is central because it can absorb discounted barrels and provide payment pathways that blunt sanctions. And we are starting to see some reaction from China. So far, it's only issuing diplomatic statements and condemnations, but on the background, we're seeing that China posture is shifting towards greater competition in the Western Hemisphere, and rather than being scared off by a potentially risky American adventure in near Venezuela that could put Chinese investments there at risk, China is looking to double down on its presence in Latin America. The likely near-term trend is continued enforcement and targeted sanctions with potential episodic spikes when seizures occur. And of course, the strategic point is deterrence by friction, making sanction trade slower, riskier, and more expensive rather than expecting a single decisive cutoff. If the Trump administration retains this level of pressure without engaging in a protracted um, campaign of escalation through conventional military means or invading Venezuela without any actual exit plan, they may actually succeed in some in destabilizing the regime and weakening it sufficiently to benefit U.S. security and economic concerns. But we are seeing that the administration is not necessarily acting in concert with each other, that there are competing voices, and there is a very uneven and inconsistent policy. So it remains to be seen what actually happens.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. Let's move on to Zelensky, the Ukraine, and here another of the project where we thought that Mr. Trump will be a big peacekeeper and must be working somewhere. But Zelensky in Germany, he is willing to give up NATO potential for durable, legally binding security guarantees. So where are we on the Russia-Ukraine war? It's like if even if they give up NATO, who is going to give security guarantees? And what does it mean? And where do we go from here? What about the 28 points and 16 points and 19 points? And what happens to the present ongoing war? It's a very difficult situation then. Even if you help us understand where is it all heading towards? It's going to be 1 year of Trump's presidency now in very few days, and nowhere we have reached. It's almost like everybody is confused. At least I'm very confused looking at from this part of the world.
Well, the first thing to know is while all of these negotiations are taking place, Russia is continuing to attack civilians in Ukraine, bombing cities, destroying infrastructure, wounding and killing civilians, recruiting and indoctrinating Ukrainian children, and confiscating property of Ukrainian citizens from Crimea, such as the famous boxer Usyk, who's become internationally known. All of these things are happening without stop. Russia's official position is that they will not agree to any ceasefire in any form. They want either peace on their terms or nothing at all. Lavrov claimed that Trump promised to turn over uh, occupied territories to Russia, and that Russia will lay official claim to any territories with significant ethnic Russian population, whether they want Russia there or not. Obviously, this is not something that anyone could really enforce. Neither Trump, who has no control of Ukrainian territory, can physically turn over the territory to Russia, nor Russia can claim territories that it has not been able to physically occupy. So all of that rhetoric flying back and forth leaves us at exactly the same place where we've started. Regarding Zelensky, he indeed agreed not to pursue a NATO claim, but it actually cost him nothing at this point because Ukraine is not eligible for NATO membership so long as its territories remain occupied. And what happens after Trump is unknowable and can change very easily to the polar opposite with a new administration. Therefore, making this claim now literally has absolutely no political impact on Zelensky's own things, own internal standing. In fact, his popularity, according to poll, has spiked to 61%, which is the highest it has been since the first months after his election to office. What is happening in terms of the security guarantees? Interestingly enough, US and Europe have come to a tentative deal which would allow for some level of military support for Ukraine in exchange for some signature regarding non cessation of hostilities in the event of this ceasefire or peace or the whatever this framework is supposed to be. However, it stops well short of NATO level Article 5 guarantees in that it would not include US or other military forces on the ground, which raises the question of who and how would enforce this deal. It would include a flow of weapons and presumably some level of predetermined actions such as targeted sanctions and supplies at times of need. Zelensky is demanding an advance on weapons before anything is really signed. Russia rejected any of this as a ceasefire framework, and it only wants a finalized peace framework. Of course, Trump and Putin's administrations have issued completely divergent comments. Trump claims that they've never been closer to a deal, whereas Russia is stating that they're very far apart and that they are not agreeing to the current set of conditions and consider them damaging. So when the two statements on the same subject are so as divergent as they are, it's very hard to see how they're going to be enforced or even concluded. US is slated to continue talks with Russia in Miami this coming weekend. It seems that so far uh, the fact that the two parties have not negotiated directly is not a particularly good sign for anything, because right now Ukraine is making separate agreements with the US, talking about investments and so forth, while Russia is looking to create buffer zone, which means its essential control over territories and a permanent presence in Ukraine, something completely unacceptable not only to Zelensky but to the Ukrainian people. Poll after poll inside Ukraine shows that they are completely opposed to such a framework. I am not sure how the Trump administration is going to convince the Russians to change their minds if they haven't already. They're very unlikely to budge. The Ukrainians don't believe any of this is going to work out at all, and that we will be back to status quo very shortly.
Absolutely. Moving away from all these things, let's move on to some good thing happening. That's Egypt and Israel are moving towards the gas deal, and looks like some reconciliation there. How should we understand this? And should we give credit for this also to Mr. Trump, or is it happening in its own way?
The deal has actually been signed. It's a $35 billion deal, which will bring tremendous economic benefits to both sides and, quite frankly, calm down a lot of the tensions and anti-Israel rhetoric inside Egyptian media, which is quite influential all across the region. I think it is a very positive development, and yes, I would give the Trump administration at least some credit. I don't know to what extent they've been involved on the background, and I'm sure there's been some independent bilateral processes taking place, but they have leaned on both parties to reconvene and to try to conclude this deal, and they have pushed for a meeting between President Sisi and Prime Minister Netanyahu mm, in a positive way. This, in my opinion, has been handled positively without unnecessarily negative pressure on either side. And it looks like there was already some interest in that succeeding because things moved very quickly towards their conclusion. I think the initial disruption was more of a PR move by the Netanyahu team to begin with. I think they were planning at some point to reconcile, but I also found that they dug themselves into a corner, into a hole that they couldn't necessarily climb out of independently. And having US appearing to push this process gave them a justification to move forward. I think that ultimately how we can best describe the role of the Trump administration. Did they necessarily fundamentally change the position of the two countries? Probably not, but I do think that they helped overcome the optics obstacles that made it more difficult to move forward.
Absolutely. Let's move on to our last topic of the day, that is the Taiwanese FM secret trip to Israel. Means it's an unlikely sort of a partnership. How are they coming together? What is the deal here? Why the visit? And what will Israel offer? Or what does Taiwan has to offer Israel?
So, the contacts between two countries have been growing recently due to common concerns due to China's increasingly significant and growing role in the Middle East. And of course, the business interests involving advanced AI chips, as well as the triangulation with the United States and other Western countries. But these contacts are still inherently sensitive because both countries are small, they navigate complex great power constraints, and they are seeking niche partnerships in technology and security while also trying not to attract negative repercussion from bigger countries. A discreet visit suggests a desire for cooperation without forcing public escalations with China or provoking any sort of um, back and forth, as we have seen happen between Japan and China after the beheading comment um, from one of the Chinese diplomats there. Israel continues to try to balance Russia ties and Western commitments, which has been a recurring dilemma, including most recently Netanyahu's comments praising his contacts with and strong relations with Putin raised a lot of eyebrows because most of the Israeli security apparatus and the public are not necessarily supportive of Russia, especially after the war, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and after Russia's ties to Hamas and Hezbollah have also been become more of a public knowledge. This is particularly concerning given that Moscow's regional role is intersecting with Israel's operational needs in ways that are not necessarily positive. Russia has redoubled on its positions in Syria. Israel claims that it would prefer Russia to stay there. Most of everybody else in Syria or even the region is looking at it with a lot of skepticism. Some argue that at this point it's less about Israel's relationship with Russia than about Israel's relationship with Donald Trump, and Netanyahu is merely trying to please Trump by making these comments, given that Trump's national security strategy explicitly indicates an interest in Russia as a potential business partner. And in fact, just recently, Trump praised India right after India has essentially invited Russia into a more strategic defense posture in the Indo-Pacific, which seems like a very strange dynamic. But in fact, if Trump's strategy for the Indo-Pacific is to create a triangle between Russia, India, and the U.S. Um, to blunt China's growing role. Not that I personally believe that would be effective, but if that is the actual position of the Trump administration, in that sense, then this pattern of communications and pressuring India in certain ways, but allowing it to engage with Russia in others, makes more sense. Taiwan, in the meantime, is seeking partners who understand gray zone pressure and cyber economic coercion, and Israel does have that relevant experience and best practices to share. Meanwhile, Israel's posture towards Putin is often framed as pragmatic deconfliction, but it carries reputational and alliance costs. Now, the balance question here is whether Israel can expand ties with Taiwan while limiting damage with China and managing the Russia optics simultaneously. Many think that sooner or later Israel is going to have to make a choice. China has leverage through trade and diplomatic signaling, but Taiwan offers high value technology collaboration, especially in resilience. The most plausible outcome is selective technical cooperation kept below the most visible political threshold, at least in the short term. The larger risk is triangulation. If Israel is seen as hedging between rival blocs, partners will start questioning reliability and essentially forcing Israel to choose. And that has happened in the past when Israel allowed China to invest into its Haifa port and other infrastructure. US put a lot of pressure on it to withdraw from these deals. Finally, Israel can possibly find temporary balance through compartmentalization, but it becomes increasingly harder when global polarization sharpens and symbolism drives reactions and can be as important as kinetic or economic engagement itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lots of things happening, lots of permutations and combinations happening. And every 2 weeks, you come with us and help us understand what's happening in the world. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World, according to Irina Tsukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, and it's been great as always.